Thank you everyone for being here. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, and I'm going to be talking today about a novel by Miguel de Cervantes from the year of 1613. And this is a novel called The Little Gypsy Girl, or in Spanish, La Gitanilla. And it's a novel that has not really been approached from the perspective of women's studies very much. And even those critics who talk about the topic that I'm going to be talking about, like Jesus González Maestro, for example, they do not come to this topic from the perspective of women's studies. So we'll see. I'm going to start and we'll see where this takes us. It's called Women and Social Class in Miguel de Cervantes' The Little Gypsy Girl. In the prologue to his exemplary novels, published in 1613, Miguel de Cervantes claims for himself the honor of having been the first author to write original novellas in Spanish. Quote, "There is one more thing I would like to make clear, and that is that I am the first to write novels in Castilian, for the many novels that have appeared in print are all translated from foreign tongues, and these are my very own, neither imitated nor stolen." Cervantes describes them as exemplary because, quote, "there is not one from which you cannot extract some profitable example." But then he goes on to say that they were written merely for the entertainment of the reader, who should under no circumstance look for any glimmer of seriousness in them. Quote, "And so I say again, gentle reader, that you cannot make a stew with these novels I now offer you, for they have no feet, nor head, nor entrails, nor anything of the kind." He also states very emphatically that he has not meant for any of the stories in the collection to have any negative influence on anyone who may chance to read them. This passage of the prologue is worth quoting in full because it sets the tone for Cervantes' playful approach in his exemplary novels. I quote, "One thing I will venture to say, and that is that if by any chance it should happen that the reading of these novels might lead my readers into evil thoughts or desires, I would rather cut off the hand with which I wrote them than have them published. At my time of life I cannot afford to mess around with the hereafter, for at 55 I might have 9 years left, and I could still beat them to it." Well, Cervantes was, he died in 1616, so about 400 years ago, right? Is that right? About 400 years ago, yeah. What is it then? Are Cervantes' exemplary novels merely idle literary exercises aimed at entertaining his readership? Or are they serious texts from which we may derive a specific lesson? Are they meant as mere trifles or as vehicles for social criticism and commentary? The answer to these questions must be understood in the context of the equivocal nature of Cervantes' literature, which is constantly setting traps to ensnare those readers who do not read his texts carefully. Cervantes' approach may also be read in a more practical, strategic way. Within the context of the Spanish Golden Age, the 16th and 17th centuries, the author was forced to be as vague as possible in order to avoid trouble with censors and with institutions such as the Catholic Church and the Inquisition, at whose beliefs and mandates Cervantes' texts often poke fun in a very subtle way. Thus, if Cervantes' texts sometimes come across as contradictory, it is precisely because over the years he has honed the craft of stating one thing and meaning quite another. His subtlety in this respect keeps readers constantly on their toes, forcing them to constantly question what his narrators say and how they say it. This is true, of course, in his masterpiece, Don Quixote, but also in his dramatic works, and particularly in his exemplary novels, whose very title must be taken with more than a grain of salt. As I hope to show during the course of this presentation, in this collection of novellas, most of the time nothing is exactly what it seems, and it is always necessary to do away with appearances and to go beneath the surface to discover the complexity of meaning with which the author imbues each story. This complexity and contradiction is already apparent in the titles chosen for some of the novellas. For example, The Spanish-English Lady, The Colloquy of the Dogs, and The Illustrious Scullery Maid. For how can a lady be at once Spanish and English? How could two dogs actually have a conversation? Or how could one truly describe a scullery maid as illustrious? As he always does in all his works, Cervantes is playing with the reader's expectations, making use of indeterminacy and deceit to say nothing of his penchant for overturning the generally accepted literary conventions of the time, or for challenging the boundaries between different genres. This is true also of the first novella in the collection, The Little Gypsy Girl. It's the very first one in the collection, whose protagonist, as we will see, is not really a gypsy girl. Though it has garnered quite a bit of critical attention over the centuries since its original publication, the opening story of the exemplary novels has often been approached from the point of view of ethnicity and interpreted as Cervantes' defense of the gypsy community that roamed around 16th and 17th century Spain. Although not completely erroneous, this approach misses the main point of the novella, which is not to celebrate gypsy culture and underscore the status of gypsies as social outcasts, but rather to speak for women within the gypsy community and expose the ghastly treatment that they had to endure at the hands of their male counterparts. This element is so pervasive in the text that it is hard to understand why so many Cervantistas working from a mostly feminist approach have failed to notice it. As I will show in The Little Gypsy Girl, through the character of Preciosa, Cervantes paints a harshly critical picture of the social laws that shape gypsy society, which is really a society existing within the limits of regular Spanish society, which are specifically aimed at silencing women, denying them any kind of freedom of choice, and justifying and validating violence against them. If Preciosa is able to eschew these social regulations, it is partly because, unbeknownst to her and most of those around her, she is not really a gypsy, but a woman of noble birth, and her own personality and capacity to use reason are more important to her than her identity as a gypsy. It is precisely because she seems to be so adept at reasoning that she ends up surviving within the strict moral code where she is forced to live. Several critics have famously considered The Little Gypsy Girl as a romance, a highly idealistic type of text whose protagonists must endure all sorts of difficulties that will ultimately lead them to an ending where social order is restored and they eventually find happiness. Once again, this is what the novella appears to be, and yet, as soon as we go beneath the surface, we quickly realize that Cervantes is using the form for something other than entertaining his reading audience. Cervantes also complicates things by introducing into this setting elements culled from the picaresque tradition, which remained quite popular at the time. The main character in the story is a noble woman named Constanza de Acevedo, who as a child was abducted by an old gypsy woman and raised as a gypsy under the name of Preciosa. The use of several different names by the same character is a constant feature of Cervantes' fiction and very prominent, most famously, in Don Quixote. And here the name of the little gypsy girl, which means precious, encapsulates her physical description. Preciosa is always described by the narrator as an extremely beautiful girl with an astounding talent for dancing and singing, an attraction to be admired and enjoyed by everyone around her. Quote, "Little Preciosa became the most admired dancer in all the tribes of gypsydom. She was the most beautiful and discreet of all the maidens. Nay, she shone conspicuous not only among the gypsies, but even as compared with the most lovely and accomplished damsels, whose praises were at that time sounded forth by the voice of fame." The narrator also emphasizes how psychologically mature the girl, who is no more than 15 years old, seems to be, and goes on to note that she can read and write, which was unheard of among real gypsy women at the time. Both Preciosa and the old gypsy woman who raised her use her talents as a singer and dancer for an economic profit, and her accomplishments do not go unnoticed by most of the people who see her perform. Indeed, many of them express the opinion that, quote, "'Tis a pity that the maiden is a gypsy. Truly, she deserves to be the daughter of some great lord." There are many cases of this kind of foreshadowing throughout the novella, and they always emphasize the fact that Preciosa, besides being the object of spectacle and admiration wherever she chances to go, is remarkable within the context of gypsy society precisely because she is different, because she does not fit the expected profile that her identity as a gypsy should warrant. This is especially noticeable in her ability to read and write. Thus, when a cavalier appears to be surprised that Preciosa knows how to read, the old gypsy woman who raised her says to him, "Aye, And to write, too. I have brought up my grandchild as if she was a lawyer's daughter. The fact that Preciosa can read and write sets her apart from the rest of the gypsies, mostly the females, but also the males, who can barely sign their own names, and who lead lives that force them to live by their wits, in the best of cases as petty criminals. Let us take a look at the way that Cervantes describes the society within a society of the gypsies in this story, a depiction that is peppered with elements from the picaresque tradition and that appears already at the very beginning of the novella. This is how the novella starts. It would almost seem that the gitanos and gitanas, that's the Spanish word for gypsy, or male and female gypsies, had been sent into the world for the sole purpose of thieving. Born of parents who are thieves, reared among thieves, and educated as thieves, they finally go forth perfected in their vocation, accomplished at all points, and ready for every species of roguery. In them, the love of thieving and the ability to exercise it are qualities inseparable from their existence and never lost until the hour of their death. As we can see, the very opening lines of the novella leave little room to interpret this text as a defense of gypsies in 17th century Spain. On the contrary, Cervantes qualifies them as thieves and rogues, their exploits not far behind those of literary rogues from the picaresque tradition, such as Lazarillo de Tormes and Guzmán de Alfarache. Cervantes intimates, however, that this is so precisely because gypsies, like the anti-heroes of picaresque novels, are forced to live in the margins of society, and the regular Spanish society of the Golden Age would not allow them to achieve any sort of respectability. In this way, by describing them as social outcasts, Cervantes seems to be speaking for the gypsies, taking their side and reflecting their difficulties that they face. They are criminals, yes, but they do not really have much of a choice. Yet once again, this is what Cervantes appears to be doing. As we can infer from the description of Preciosa, a little gypsy girl who is not really a gypsy, everything in this text is built on appearances, and as readers we must tread carefully in order to avoid falling into Cervantes' literary trap. The image of the gypsies portrayed in this novella is completed with the appearance on the scene of Juan de Cárcamo, a nobleman who falls in love with Preciosa upon seeing her one night by chance and decides to become a gypsy and live by their social norms in order to be closer to Preciosa and hopefully gain her favors. Like Preciosa, Juan de Cárcamo also changes his name to go along with his newfound identity as a gypsy. Now he is known as Andrés Caballero, his last name, Caballero, an allusion to his noble origins, and he will have to undergo a kind of ceremony of initiation before he can be fully considered a member of gypsy society. This transformation of a high-born nobleman into a lowly gypsy is yet another example of the romance-like idealism of this text, something that would be hardly likely in the context of 17th century Spain. But it offers Cervantes the chance to give us an account of the laws by which gypsy society is organized and to expose them as a suppression of any rights that women might have within this social context. During the course of the ceremony, the old gypsy man who officiates it paints a highly idealized portrait of gypsy life. But when it comes to the subject of marriage and their relations between the sexes, he is very clear as to the role and status of women within gypsy society. I quote, "This girl," meaning Preciosa, "who is the flower and cream of all beauty among the gitanas in Spain, we give to you either for your wife or your mistress, for in that respect you may do whatever shall be most to your liking. Since our free and easy life is not subject to squeamish scruples or to much ceremony." This is in the context of a ceremony. "Look at her well and see if she suits you, or if there is anything in her you dislike. If there is, choose from among the maidens here present the one you like best, and we will give her to you. But bear in mind that once your choice is made, you must not quit it for another, nor make or meddle either with the married women or the maids. We live free from the bitter plague of jealousy, and though incest is frequent among us, there is no adultery." Enough said, I think. From these words, we may infer that in gypsy society, women are treated as mere objects to be bestowed on any man who may desire them, and even though incest is apparently permitted, adultery is emphatically forbidden. On the subject of justice, particularly when adultery is committed, the old gypsy is grimly clear. I quote again, "If a wife or a mistress is unfaithful, we do not go ask the courts of justice to punish. But we ourselves are the judges and executioners of our wives and mistresses, and make no more ado about killing them in the mountains and desert places than if they were vermin. As we can see, justice within Gypsy society exists outside of the jurisdiction of regular society. And in this context, women not only do not have any right to choose, but they are always assumed to be the guilty party in the case of adultery, and even executed and buried anonymously and with impunity. Again, this sounds hardly like a defense of gypsies on the part of Cervantes, who is rather exposing and condemning the unfavorable conditions under which women are forced to live within gypsy society, which does not accord them a voice. In this society, then, women are subjugated by the desires of men who have created the laws and systematically mistreated by them. Preciosa, however, far from accepting these moral norms, speaks openly against them, affirming her individuality within a social context that attempts to silence them. Her speech following the ceremony once again shows that reason is the main element that shapes her personality. I quote what she says in response to this. Whereas these señores are lawgivers, she says to Andrés, have determined according to their laws that I should be yours, and as such have given me up to you, I have decreed in accordance with the law of my own will, which is the strongest of all, that I will not be so, except upon the conditions heretofore concerted between us two. Rather than quietly accepting what the gypsies attempt to impose upon her, Preciosa sets her own rules and conditions. Andrés will have to live among the gypsies for at least 2 years before she will consent to any sort of relationship between the two. This is again now quoting what Preciosa says again. Conditions supersede laws, states, and very emphatically Preciosa, who goes on to declare that as far as she is concerned, she will always retain her right to make her own decisions about her life. I quote from what she says again. These señores may give up my body to you, but not my soul, which is free, was born free, and shall remain free. Preciosa's words echo those of the shepherdess Marcela in the first part of Don Quixote, with the important difference that Preciosa makes use of this philosophy to operate within a society that is not favorable for women, whereas Marcela proclaims in a highly idealistic fashion her freedom while living alone among sheep and goats up on a mountain and far away from society. Unlike Marcela, Preciosa is one of the most rational characters in Cervantes' fiction, and it is precisely her ability to use reason that empowers her to survive under adverse conditions. Thus, when Andrés promises to obey her conditions and swears to remain faithful to her, she firmly replies, quote, I want no oaths or promises, Señor Andrés. It will be my business to take care of myself if at any time you should think of offending me. That's the end of quote there. For Preciosa, therefore, truth lies in facts, not in words. I'll say that again. Truth lies in facts and not in words for this character. When towards the end of the novella, it is discovered that Preciosa is not an unusually mature gypsy girl, but a noble woman named Constanza de Acevedo, the regular social order is restored in the typical manner of romances and Byzantine novels, but Cervantes has already had the opportunity to make his point clear, and the point, as we have seen, is far from being a defense of gypsies as an ethnic group, as most critics have traditionally noted. Such a reading is grossly misdirected and does not account for the plurality of meaning of an exemplary novel that should be read more appropriately from the standpoint of gender. In The Little Gypsy Girl, Cervantes makes use of the traditionally idealistic genre of romance to explore a topic that it is far from idealistic, the harsh treatment that women were accorded within the society of gypsies and in a more general sense within Spanish Golden Age society at large. As a